What makes a house a home? Is it the memories, the people who fill it, or the sense of safety it provides? For most, a home is a sanctuary, a place where the chaos of the outside world can't reach. But what if that sanctuary wasn't as secure as you believed? What if the walls that once sheltered you began to betray you? What if the calls coming from inside your house weren't a mistake, a prank, or a coincidence, but something far worse? This is the story of Ben, a 16-year-old boy who stayed home alone for the first time. What began as a quiet weekend of freedom, a chance to enjoy the silence of an empty house, became something entirely different. It began on the second night with a sound so familiar it felt harmless, the ring of a telephone. But by the time the ringing stopped, Ben's world had shifted. He was no longer alone, no longer safe. When Ben finally answered the call, a faint and distorted voice greeted him. It whispered his name in a way that chilled his blood. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a prank. Whoever or whatever was on the other end knew things no one else could. Things about Ben, about the house, about the empty spaces that should have been silent but weren't. The calls persisted, and the voice became bolder, more descriptive. Each word stripped away the fragile sense of safety Ben had clung to. And when he traced the calls, what he discovered was something no one should ever have to face. This isn't just a story about a boy left home alone. This is a story about the fragile line between reality and fear, and what happens when something crosses it. Ben had always wondered what it would feel like to have the whole house to himself. His parents were going out of town for the weekend, a rare getaway for them, and a first for him. No rules, no interruptions, just 2 days of peace and quiet. Freedom, you call if you need anything, right? His mom had said, her hand hovering on the doorknob, reluctant to leave. Ben had laughed it off. "Mom, I'm 16. I think I can handle a weekend on my own." For the first 24 hours, it was everything he'd imagined. He reveled in the freedom, no one telling him to turn the volume down, no bedtime, and the house was his alone. But something about being alone for too long changes the way you see familiar spaces. The hum of the refrigerator seemed louder. The shadows in the corners of the room lingered just a little too long. And then there were the sounds, a creak on the stairs, the faint tap of something against the window. Nothing unusual for an old house, or so Ben told himself. It wasn't that anything had happened exactly, but Ben couldn't shake the feeling that something about the house felt different. The air was heavier, the silence deeper, and those small sounds, the creaks, the faint thuds, felt less like the house settling and more like. That evening, as Ben settles in to watch a movie, the flickering lamp catches his attention again. He adjusts the bulb, his face inches from the light, when it suddenly goes out entirely. He curses under his breath, fumbling in the drawer for a flashlight. The beam of light sweeps across the room, casting long, exaggerated shadows. It catches something on the far wall, a picture frame hanging slightly askew. Ben tilts his head, walking over to straighten it. As he does, the flashlight flickers, and for a brief moment, the reflection in the glass shows something behind him. He spins around, the light sweeping the room, but there's nothing there. Just the empty living room, still and quiet. He exhales a shaky laugh. "Get it together, Ben," he muttered to himself, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. But the seed of unease had already been planted. Ben thought the worst thing about being home alone was the quiet. He was wrong. The quiet wasn't the problem. It was what came after. For Ben, the quiet of the house at night was comforting at first. The hum of the refrigerator, the gentle creak of the floorboards, sounds he'd grown up with, were a familiar backdrop to his newfound independence. But as the hours passed, those same sounds started to feel less like background noise and more like interruptions. A reminder that in the stillness of the house, he wasn't truly alone. It was odd hearing the landline ring. Nobody called the house phone anymore. Not since his parents got cell phones years ago. It was probably a wrong number, he thought. Still, curiosity got the better of him. Ben hesitates for a moment, then gets up, walking over to the phone. "Hello," he said, his voice casual, almost bored. But the response he got wasn't what he expected. The faint sound of static crackles through the line, broken only by a distorted voice whispering, "Ben." It wasn't loud. It wasn't clear. But there was no mistaking it. Someone or something on the other end of the line had said his name. Just once. Just barely loud enough to hear. It shouldn't have meant anything, but it sent a shiver up his spine. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice firmer now, more annoyed than frightened. But there was no answer, just more static, and then the faintest sound of breathing. Ben's brow furrows. He glances at the clock on the wall. 9:37 p.m. Too late for prank calls. He exhales sharply, muttering, "Real funny," before slamming the receiver back onto the cradle. Ben glances up, looking toward the staircase at the far end of the living room. His eyes narrow, but he shakes his head and returns his attention to his phone. He told himself it was nothing. The house made noises like that all the time. It was old and old houses settled. That's all it was. Ben tried to push it out of his mind. It was probably a prank, one of his friends messing with him, or a wrong number. That's what he told himself. But no matter how much he tried to move on, something about the call stayed with him. It wasn't the voice itself. It was the way it had felt, hearing his name spoken aloud in the dark. He shakes his head, muttering under his breath, and heads to his room. As he reaches his door, the phone rings once more, sharp and jarring in the silence. Ben freezes. The first call was strange. The second was unsettling. This time, the sound of the phone wasn't just startling. It felt deliberate, purposeful. It wasn't a wrong number. Someone wanted him to answer. Ben walks slowly back down the stairs, each step creaking beneath his weight. It rings again and again and again until finally he picks it up. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice sharper now, frustration giving way to something else, something closer to fear. The static is louder this time, broken by faint, distorted laughter. Then a voice. "I see you." Ben stares at the phone, his breathing shallow. Slowly, he places it back on the cradle. Ben didn't move for a long time after that. He just stood there, staring at the phone, his mind racing. He told himself it was a prank. It had to be a prank. But something about the voice, something about the way it had sounded, the way it had laughed, felt too real. Ben didn't know it yet, but the calls were only the beginning. What came next would change everything. They say when you're alone, your mind plays tricks on you. The creaks and groans of an empty house become louder, more insistent. Shadows stretch longer than they should, and the air feels heavier. But for Ben, this was no trick of the mind. What he dismissed as his imagination was only the beginning. Ben sits in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV. The phone call still lingers in his mind, but he's doing his best to ignore it. On the coffee table in front of him, a bowl of popcorn sits untouched. He told himself it was just a prank, a bad one, sure, but harmless. He was determined to enjoy the rest of his night, even if the lingering unease wouldn't completely go away. As the TV bathes the room in flickering light, something in the background shifts. The chair at the far end of the room, the one by the window, moves. Not much, just an inch or two. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't obvious. But when Ben glanced toward the window a moment later, something felt off. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he swore the chair wasn't where it had been before. Ben frowns, getting up to inspect. He nudges the chair back into place, shaking his head. "Stupid old house," he mutters to himself, convincing no one. As the night stretches on, Ben makes his way to the kitchen for a drink. The overhead light casts harsh shadows, and the house feels colder now, though the thermostat hasn't changed. He tried to keep himself busy, anything to shake the feeling that had settled over him. But the house wasn't making it easy. The sounds he'd grown up with were different tonight. Louder, closer. And then there were the footsteps. Ben freezes mid-step, his hand still on the refrigerator door. The sound is faint at first, like someone shifting their weight on the floor above. Then it grows clearer, slow, deliberate steps, crossing the length of the upstairs hallway. It didn't make sense. He was alone. He knew he was alone. But the sound of footsteps, that wasn't something you could imagine. Ben grabs a kitchen knife, his knuckles white as he clutches it. Slowly, he moves toward the staircase, his breath shallow, each step creaking under his weight. He calls out, "Hello." His voice echoes through the house. There's no response. He wanted to believe it was nothing. Maybe the house settling. Maybe the wind. But deep down he knew better. He waited, listening, but the sound didn't come again. At least not yet. Later, as Ben double-checks the locks on the doors and windows, he finds one in the dining room open, just an inch. Ben was sure he had locked it earlier. He always locked it. But now, as the cold night air crept in through the small opening, he found himself questioning everything. Had he forgotten? Or had someone else opened it? He shuts the window quickly, latching it with trembling hands. His reflection in the glass looks back at him, distorted by the faint smudge of condensation. For a moment, it almost seems like there's something behind him. But when he spins around, the room is empty. It wasn't until later that he started noticing the patterns. The chair, the footsteps, the window, small things, barely noticeable on their own. But together, they painted a picture Ben didn't want to see. Ben stays in his room, pacing. His eyes dart toward the doorway every few seconds, as if expecting someone or something to appear. The house feels alive now, every creak and groan amplified in his mind. Still, he told himself it was nothing. He couldn't let himself believe otherwise, because if it wasn't nothing, what was it? Just as he's starting to calm down, the phone rings again. Ben hesitates this time, staring at the phone from across the room. The sound is sharper now, more insistent. He picks it up, his hand trembling. "Who is this?" he demands, his voice tight. The same static crackles through the line, followed by that faint, distorted laughter. Then the voice speaks again. "Did you lock the window in the dining room?" Ben's blood runs cold. He grips the phone tighter, his breathing shallow. "Who are you?" he shouts, his voice cracking. The voice doesn't answer directly. Instead, It continues, calm and detached. You shouldn't have turned off the lights in the kitchen. Ben stands frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear. He looks toward the kitchen, where the doorway now gapes like a dark void. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't his imagination. Whoever, or whatever, was calling him wasn't just outside his house. It was inside, watching, waiting, but the worst was yet to come. Fear doesn't come all at once. It starts small, an itch in the back of your mind, a whisper that grows louder the more you try to ignore it. For Ben, the whispers were turning into screams. Each unexplained sound, each flicker of movement in the corner of his eye, pushed him closer to the edge. But it was the phone calls that tipped the balance. He couldn't ignore them anymore. He had to know. Ben sits at the kitchen table, the dim overhead light casting long shadows across the room. The landline sits in front of him, innocuous and silent. He stares at it for what feels like hours before finally reaching out. He told himself he was overreacting, that there was a perfectly logical explanation. But the truth was, he already knew that wasn't the case. He picks up the receiver, his fingers fumbling over the buttons as he navigates the call log. The first thing he noticed was the number, or rather, the lack of one. It wasn't a contact, and it wasn't a standard string of digits. Instead, the screen showed something impossible, a blank space where the number should have been. Ben's hand shakes as he puts the phone down. He stares at it, willing it to make sense. But the more he looks, the more the unease grows. It didn't add up. Calls had to come from somewhere, someone. But this wasn't a prank. This wasn't an accident. This was something else. He stands abruptly, grabbing the flashlight from the kitchen counter. The house felt different now. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier. Every creak of the floorboards beneath his feet felt like a warning, urging him to stop. But he couldn't. He had to know, because the alternative, doing nothing, was worse. He moves toward the staircase, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, the stairs groaning under his weight. The hallway stretches before him, dimly lit by the weak glow of the flashlight. The doors to the bedrooms are all closed, their shadows looming against the walls. He told himself he was being ridiculous, that there was nothing up here but dust and old furniture. But the feeling in his chest, the one that made it hard to breathe, told a different story. Ben pauses outside the spare room, his hand hovering over the doorknob, sweat beading on his forehead as he gathers his courage. He pushes the door open. The room is small and cluttered, filled with forgotten belongings and old furniture. Dust motes hang in the air, illuminated by the beam of the flashlight. At first there was nothing, just silence and shadows. But then he heard it, faint and muffled, the sound of a phone ringing. It's barely audible, but unmistakable. The phone was ancient. It hadn't worked in years, its cord frayed and its surface covered in dust. But somehow it was ringing. Ben's breath catches in his throat. He steps closer, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The ringing grows louder, more insistent. He didn't want to answer it. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to run. But something kept him rooted to the spot. Curiosity, fear, or maybe something else entirely. The phone stops ringing just as Ben reaches out to touch it. The sudden silence is deafening, the tension in the air almost unbearable. But before he can react, His own cell phone buzzes in his pocket. The screen lights up, displaying a single word: unknown. The calls weren't coming from outside. They were here, inside the house. And now they were waiting for him to answer. The screen fades to black, leaving only the sound of Ben's shaky breathing and the faint hum of the house settling. At that moment, standing in the doorway of the spare room, Ben could feel it. The same chill that had settled in his chest, creeping down his spine. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. But what he found instead was emptiness, and it left him questioning everything he thought he knew about his own home. Ben steps into the room, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The air feels thick, stifling, like the room is holding its breath. There is no movement, no sound aside from his own rapid breathing. For a moment, the room seems untouched, as though nothing has changed since the last time he was in here days, weeks, months ago. The furniture remains where it should be, covered in layers of dust. The curtains hang motionless. The air smells faintly of old wood and something more forgotten. Ben moves slowly, his feet making soft, hesitant sounds against the floorboards. He scans the room. The desk, cluttered with old papers and books, looks as if it hasn't been disturbed for years. And yet, something doesn't sit right. The phone on the desk, an old, outdated model, sits there, the receiver off the hook, dangling like an open invitation to make contact. Ben approaches the desk, his eyes glued to the phone. The receiver hangs by its cord, swings slightly, as if it had been recently used. His heart races, and his hand trembles as he reaches for it. But before he can touch it, his eyes wander across the desk to something else, something far more unsettling. Among the clutter on the desk, half hidden beneath a pile of papers, is an old family photograph. Ben picks it up, his breath catching in his throat. The picture is faded, the edges curled from age. It shows a much younger version of him, sitting on the same couch he had grown up on. His parents are beside him, smiling, laughing, happy. But then, Ben notices something strange. In the background of the photo, barely visible, stands a figure. A person he doesn't recognize. Their face is blurry, distorted, almost as if it's been intentionally obscured. But their eyes, those eyes, dark and wide, seem to stare directly at him. Ben's fingers grip the photo tightly, the weight of it suddenly feeling like too much. The camera zooms in on the figure, its face still a blur, the shadows seeming to shift in unnatural ways. Who was this person? And why was their image captured in a family photo? Why hadn't he ever seen them before? He stares at the photograph for a long moment, his mind racing with questions. The air around him feels colder now, and the once comforting familiarity of the room starts to feel foreign, alien, even hostile. Suddenly, the phone rings again, shattering the silence. It's louder now, more insistent. Ben jumps, his body stiffening with fear. He doesn't want to answer it. He doesn't want to even touch the thing. But his hand moves of its own accord, reaching for the receiver. But when he lifts the phone, the voice on the other end is different this time. It's louder, more urgent, and it's no longer a whisper. The voice pleads, raw and desperate. Leave. You have to leave. It's not safe. They're coming. Ben's heart pounds in his chest, his breath shallow and ragged. The voice seems to echo in his mind, over and over again. It's almost as if the room itself is alive with the sound, the walls vibrating with it. He slams the phone back into its cradle, the noise of it ringing through the empty room. But the call doesn't stop. It continues. The voice, now distorted, pleading again. Leave now, before it's too late. The walls around him seem to close in, the shadows stretching further, creeping closer. Every corner of the room feels like it's watching him, waiting for him to make a move. He had to leave. The voice was right. But where would he go? And what if it followed him? Ben takes a few steps back, his body shaking with fear. He glances toward the door, the only exit, but something in the room feels wrong. The photograph, the voice, the lingering sense of someone else in the house, it all weighs on him, pressing down like an invisible force. Ben knew he wasn't alone. He hadn't been alone for a long time. Something had followed him here, something he couldn't explain, something he didn't want to believe existed. He turns toward the window, hoping for a way out, but the curtain blows gently, as if something inside the room is exhaling or waiting. It felt like the room was shifting, as though the walls were closing in on him, warping, transforming before his eyes. No matter how hard he tried to look away, the photograph in his hand kept pulling him back. That blurry face in the background, its eyes. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was staring directly at him, demanding his attention. The phone rings again. Louder now. The voice is pleading once more, almost frantic. Leave now before it's too late. Ben's eyes dart around the room, his panic rising. He throws the photograph down onto the desk, but when he looks back, it's gone. The space where it had been is empty. It was as if the room itself had swallowed it up. The face in the photo, had it been real? Or had he imagined it? Was this really his house? Or was it something else altogether? The phone continues to ring, its sound echoing through the house, now deafening. Ben looks toward the door, his pulse quickening, every part of him screaming to run. But before he can make his move, the lights flicker again. For the briefest moment, the room goes dark, and in that darkness, he hears something soft, quiet at first, but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps moving toward him from behind. Someone was here. Someone knows something was inside the house with him. The door slams shut behind him. By now, Ben had lost track of what was real and what was not. The house, once a place of refuge, had transformed into a prison. Each corner, each creak in the floorboards, each flicker of light a reminder of something far worse than mere loneliness. The moment the door slammed shut behind him, Ben's heart skipped a beat. His breath became ragged, shallow, and his thoughts blurred in the chaotic storm of fear that seemed to grip him from all sides. Every sound, every movement felt amplified in that suffocating silence. It was as if the house itself was alive, responding to his every thought, every action, every fear. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, leaving him standing in the suffocating darkness. He reached for the wall, his hands trembling, fingertips grazing the familiar texture of the wallpaper. But there was something different about it now, something cold, unyielding. And then the first slam, the door down the hallway. It hit the frame with a force that shook the house. Ben turned, his eyes wide, but all he could see were shadows moving in the corners of the room, dark and shapeless. Another door slammed, louder this time, and then another. The house was closing in on him. There was no escape. He staggered back, his heart racing in his chest. His breath came in short, Frantic gasps, the air thick and heavy. He reached out, trying to steady himself, but the walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The house was alive, and it was hungry. And then it came, that voice he had thought was coming from the phone, the voice that had haunted him for so long. But now it was inside his head, louder than ever, reverberating through his skull. It wasn't a voice on the other end of the line. It was his mind playing tricks on him, or perhaps, just perhaps, his mind had become the line itself. The voice was inside him now, inescapable. It wasn't a whisper anymore, it was a scream, a command, an unrelenting force. Leave now before it's too late. Ben staggered forward, his mind racing to understand. The voice wasn't just a whisper on the phone. It was something deeper, something more intimate. It was as if it had taken root inside him, feeding off his fear, his desperation. It knew his thoughts before he could even think them. Was it me? Or was it something else? Was it the house? The photograph? The thing I thought I saw in the reflection? Ben's eyes darted around, frantic. The house had become a maze, every hallway, every door leading him deeper into a nightmare that had no end. The phone was ringing again, louder this time, the sound of it rattling through his skull like a hammer. No, I can't answer it again. I can't let it take hold. He turned and ran for the front door, his hands fumbling for the handle. But something was wrong. The door was locked. It wouldn't budge. His panic surged. He slammed his shoulder into it, pushing with all his strength. But the door remained immovable, like it had been welded shut. He wasn't going anywhere. The house wouldn't let him leave. Another door slammed, this time right behind him, and the sound was deafening. Ben spun around, fear gripping him tighter than ever. He could hear movement now, footsteps in the dark. But they weren't just outside the room. No, they were everywhere. All around him. They were inside his mind. The house wasn't just trapping him, and it was pulling him in, consuming him from the inside out. The footsteps didn't belong to a person, not anymore. They were echoes, remnants of something that had lived here long before he had. The lights flickered again, plunging him into complete darkness. But this time, the dark wasn't silent. There was a hum, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to rise from the floorboards, like the house itself was shaking with something. Something hungry, something that wanted to devour him. Ben's breathing grew louder in his ears, frantic, desperate. He needed to get out. He needed to run. But where would he go? How could he escape something that wasn't just inside the house, but inside him, too? The house was no longer just a place. It had become a living, breathing thing. The walls were no longer just walls. They were eyes, they were ears, they were alive. And they knew exactly where Ben was. Ben's eyes flicked to the front door once more. The handle was still locked, still immovable. He had to escape. But no matter how hard he pulled, how much force he exerted, the door wouldn't open. It was as though the house itself was holding him inside, refusing to let him leave. He banged on the door, but it was no use. The house didn't want him to leave. Not yet. Not until it had what it wanted. His mind raced. The voice had said something before. Something about leaving before it was too late. But how could he have left? How could he have known? The house had already decided for him. It had already started, already begun its insidious work. The door wouldn't open, and neither would his mind. Ben stumbled back, his mind unraveling. The footsteps grew louder. He couldn't tell if they were coming from outside the house or if they were in his head. The walls closed in, and the air became thick, heavy. Something was there, standing just beyond the edge of the light. Something waiting. The door wasn't the only thing locked. The house had taken his mind, his will, and now it was waiting for him to finally break. The voice came again, louder, clearer. Leave. Now. Before it's too late. Ben couldn't run. He couldn't escape. There was no way out. The house had already claimed him. It was only a matter of time before it took the last piece of him, the part of him that could still resist. The lights flickered one final time, and then everything went black. The silence was deafening, but in that silence, something shifted. Ben's heart beat faster. His breath became erratic. He was still in the house that wasn't really a house at all. The house that had become something else, something that wanted him, something that needed him. Was it too late? The question lingered in the dark. And then a faint sound, the softest whisper. It's already too late. In the cold, suffocating silence of the house, time seemed to stretch, each moment lingering like an eternity. Ben, exhausted and overwhelmed by the horror unfolding around him, sank to his knees in the center of the living room. His body, once filled with adrenaline, now felt like a lifeless shell. The walls seemed to close in, pressing down on him, forcing him to the ground. Ben's chest heaved, his breath shallow and uneven. He could hear the soft, insistent sound of the phone ringing in the distance, but it was no longer a sound that frightened him. No, now it was a reminder of something far darker than mere fear. He couldn't run anymore. He couldn't fight it. There was nowhere to escape. The house had done its work. It had torn him apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but this hollow shell, this husk of a person who couldn't even trust his own mind anymore. He could feel it now, the creeping sensation that something was inside him, a presence, something that was neither part of the house nor part of the world he knew. It was something more intimate. It was him, or rather a part of him, a part he had buried so deep that he hadn't even realized it existed. It wasn't the house that was haunting him. It was himself. The voice came again, this time different. It wasn't distant, like it had been before. No, this time it was inside him. The voice didn't come from the phone, didn't come from the walls, didn't come from anywhere except inside his own head. Ben, you think you're the only one here? Ben's eyes widened as the words settled in. They weren't just words. They were truths he had buried deep within himself. Truths he had refused to acknowledge. The voice continued, low and almost sorrowful, as though it were speaking from the depths of his own soul. I've always been here, Ben. You can't escape me. You never could. The house is just a reflection of what you are, what we are. Ben's mind reeled. He couldn't process it. His heart pounded in his chest, the blood rushing in his ears. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to believe it. But deep down in the pit of his stomach, he knew it was true. What do you mean? Who are you? Ben's voice cracked, his throat raw. I'm you, Ben. A part of you you've locked away. The part you never wanted to see. The part that the house, the place you're in now, has brought back. Ben's eyes darted around the room, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His reflection flickered in the dim light of the living room, just behind him. caught in the mirror hanging on the wall. He turned instinctively, his heart hammering as his gaze locked onto the reflection. But what he saw stopped him dead in his tracks. In the mirror, Ben's reflection stood frozen. But unlike him, it wasn't just still, it was different. It wasn't mimicking his every movement. It wasn't following him. "No," Ben whispered, his voice trembling as he took a step closer to the mirror. His reflection was smiling. Ben's hand shook as he reached out toward the glass, trying to touch it, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The reflection remained still, its grin widening unnaturally, the eyes vacant, hollow. "You should have left, Ben. You should have left when you had the chance," the voice inside his head whispered, echoing from the reflection, as if it too were part of him. Ben recoiled, his mind reeling with the implications of what was happening. The room seemed to shift, the walls growing larger, darker, and the air colder. His reflection didn't move, but it was still watching him, its eyes following him with an unnatural intensity. "I'm part of you. Always have been. Always will be." The voice inside his head chuckled softly, a dark, guttural sound that sent a shiver down his spine. Ben backed away from the mirror, his body trembling, his legs weak. He could feel the weight of his own thoughts pressing in on him. How long had this part of him been there waiting? How long had it been biding its time, ready to reveal itself? He had been so desperate to forget it, to bury it, to hide from it. And now it was here. It had come out. "You can't run from me, Ben. You've been running from yourself." Ben's knees gave way, and he collapsed to the floor, overwhelmed by the weight of the truth. The house, the voice, the terror, it had all been leading to this moment. It had always been inside him. He was the one who had summoned it. He was the one who had invited it in. The house was just a mirror that reflected the darkest parts of his soul. And now he was trapped. Just as Ben thought he couldn't take it any longer, the landline rang again. The sound of the shrill tone sliced through the air, cutting into his thoughts. He glanced at the phone, still sitting on the table across the room. "No," he muttered, his voice raw, barely a whisper. He couldn't answer it. Not again. But then, almost as if on instinct, his hand reached out. He picked up the receiver. "Hello?" His voice was weak, his body trembling with exhaustion. The voice on the other end was eerily calm. "Ben, you know it's too late now, don't you?" Ben's eyes widened in horror as the voice continued, its tone flat, almost bored. But behind it, something else, a presence, lingered, growing stronger. The walls seemed to close in once more, the darkness thickening around him, choking him. "You've been here before. You just never remembered." And then, for the briefest of moments, Ben understood. He understood what the house had been trying to tell him all along. It wasn't the house that was haunted. It was him. He was the one who had been haunting the house all this time. He had been trapped in his own mind, reliving the same night, the same terror, over and over again. But now there was no escape. And in the reflection of the darkened mirror behind him, a shadow moved and the phone line went dead. And in the darkness, the phone rang one last time. The truth about that night, about what really happened in that house, remains a mystery. Was Ben just a victim of his own mind, pushed to the brink by something he couldn't understand? Or was there something far more dangerous, something far older, lurking in the shadows of that home? Something waiting to be unleashed? We may never know the full extent of the horror that transpired that night, but one thing is certain. Ben was never the same after that. The house, the voices, they became part of him, and maybe, in some twisted way, he became part of them. But the question remains, what do you think really happened in that house? Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? Something so terrifying, so impossible, that even now you can't make sense of it? Maybe it was a voice that shouldn't have been there, or a shadow that moved when no one was around. Maybe, like Ben, you found yourself trapped in a place you couldn't escape, not because it was locked, but because it was part of you. But we want to hear from you. Share your story in the comments below. Was it just your imagination? Or could it be something more? Perhaps there's more to this world than we realize. Maybe you've had an encounter with something beyond. If you found yourself shivering during tonight's story, if you couldn't look away, then don't forget to like this video. Subscribe if you want more tales that will make your skin crawl. And make sure you turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode. And if you think this story was unsettling, wait until you hear what we have in store next week. We've uncovered a case even darker than this one, but don't take our word for it. Come back next time and be prepared for the unspeakable.